Okay, excuse me a moment while I get a lozenge. One of these nasty things. I'll share with anybody who wants one. No, these work great. Thank you. Okay, a couple of weeks ago, the Jewish holiday Passover was celebrated. And as I'm sure you know, Passover is a celebration of when the death angel passed over the houses that were marked with lamb's blood that helped lead to the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. The Passover season is one of the most significant holy days in Judaism. In the passage that we're going to look at tonight, faithful Jews from all over the world had come to Jerusalem to take part in the festival. There were probably as many as 2 million visitors to the city for this special week. In other words, the streets were jammed, the place was packed. But this time there was a buzz all around town because of Jesus. Stories were being told about the miracles that he had performed, specifically that he had raised Lazarus from the dead. And the rumor was that Lazarus was going to be in Jerusalem with Jesus. And of course, the crowd wanted to see Jesus as well. And as Jesus came into the city, the crowd waited in expectation, eager to cheer him on, ready to proclaim him as king. Now, you've no doubt seen this portrayed in films, maybe even reenacted it back when you were a child in Sunday school. But Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and the crowd is gathered near the gate as he enters. And they're singing and shouting. Turn with me to John chapter 12, if you would. John chapter 12, and look in verse 13. It says, they took palm branches and went out to meet him. They kept shouting, Hosanna! He who comes in the name of the Lord is the blessed one, the King of Israel. Now, this moment in Jesus' ministry we call the Triumphal Entry. And this evening, I want us to take a closer look at the details of this story, as we also consider what this event in Jesus' life can teach us today. So first, I want to point out that the crowd did something that day that was a little bit seasonally incorrect. They waved palm branches as he entered into the city. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this was a time of the Passover festival. And from what I've read, palm branches weren't originally associated with Passover. They were associated with Hanukkah, which took place a few months before that. Now, seeing the crowd waving palm branches as Jesus came through the city would be like going to an Easter party, seeing Easter baskets and colored eggs and an evergreen tree covered with lights and decorations. Okay? You get the picture there? But in the joy and the excitement of being in the presence of this great and powerful prophet who claimed to be God's chosen Messiah, the crowd waved branches and shouted, Hosanna! Blessed be the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Second, I think it's significant that Jesus came into the city on a foal of a donkey. Now, there's some symbolism here that we can't overlook at all. This was the processional of a king. And when a king entered into a city intent on war, he rode on a horse. But when a king comes in peace, he rides the foal of a donkey. And so as the crowd waved their branches and shouted, Hosanna, Jesus was saying in effect, yes, I'm the king, I'm the Messiah, and I come in peace. And I feel that this is one thing that was most misunderstood about Jesus throughout the entire course of his ministry. From the crowds that followed him and the bystanders who watched him from a distance, to his enemies that sought to silence him, and even to his closest followers. They were expecting a political leader, even a military leader. They were expecting the Messiah to come and establish his kingdom on earth through the use of force and bloodshed if necessary. They believed the Messiah was coming to establish a political kingdom that would overthrow and overpower all other kingdoms. That's not the kingdom that Jesus came to establish. He didn't come to conquer any governmental authority. He came to conquer sin and death and the grave. He didn't come to overpower any political establishment. He came to empower the hearts of men and women who chose to follow him. He came to fill the world with love and to bring peace to every corner of the world. When he was born in a stable in Bethlehem, his birth was announced by the angels when they said in Luke 2:14, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." And during his ministry, he proclaimed to his followers in John 16:33, in the first half of that verse, "These things I have spoken to you, that in me you might have peace." And in John 14:27, he said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Your heart must not be troubled or fearful." Jesus came into this troubled world so that we could have peace. The kind of peace that the world simply cannot give you. And I guarantee you the kind of peace that the world doesn't even understand. The Apostle Paul calls it the peace which passes all understanding. And it's this kind of peace that Jesus came to give. We looked at John 16:33, the first part of that a little earlier. The last half of that verse says, "In this world you have tribulation, but be of good cheer, because I have overcome the world." That's the kingdom that Jesus came to establish. Not to rule in a palace, not to rule on some kind of an earthly throne, but to rule in the hearts of men and women who have surrendered their lives to him. And through this triumphal entry into Jerusalem, in which throngs of people gathered in the streets and shouted Hosanna in his name, we learn something about the kind of peace that Jesus comes to give. We've been looking at and learning how to navigate our lives through some of life's most defining moments. Initially, we looked and saw that there are no shortcuts to living in the fullness of the Christian life. It involves seasons of preparation and times of trial and focus on the moving forward that you need to do. No matter what, you got to keep moving forward. We've seen that one of life's defining moments is when we take a stand and say, I will live my life God's way, not my way. I will build my life based on what matters most in eternity, not based on what is most convenient in the moment. We've seen that one of life's defining moments is when we stand up with a courageous heart to speak for and reach out to the helpless and the hurting. It's a defining moment when we say, I will not look the other way and I will do everything I can in this situation. We've seen that another defining moment that we face day after day after day is determined by the law of where you look. We need to turn our eyes upon Jesus and focus on him. And then last week, we saw that we must also come face to face on a daily basis with life's greatest challenge. That defining moment in which we deny ourselves, take up our cross daily, and follow him. Tonight, in this last message of this series, I want to talk about another defining moment that we face as we continue our journey through life on this road less traveled. It's the decision we make to live each moment, each and every day in the now, come what may. As we look at this story that we now call Palm Sunday, I want to make 3 observations about Jesus' decision to enter Jerusalem in the manner that he did. He entered to the cheers of the crowd and to the praises of the people. He entered even though the celebration was very short-lived. And he entered even though he knew what was yet to come. So the first thing that I want you to see is that Jesus knew that in the coming days he would suffer a humiliating death, and yet he made the triumphal entry. I think it's striking that Jesus gave his followers the chance to bask in the glory of who he was, to celebrate the victory of this moment, even though he knew things that were going to be happening in the coming days that they didn't know about. Have you ever known that something bad, something not pleasant, was going to happen? You knew without a doubt that on X day, at X time, this thing was going to happen. How was your concentration all through the day or the day before? Probably not very good. When I was younger, sorry, I'm debating on which story to tell here. When I was younger, our whole family, my mom and my 2 older brothers and my aunt and uncle and their son, my cousin, and my grandmother, all piled into a couple of cars and were heading to an uncle's house who lived in Virginia. A little bit of a road trip there with 4 younger children. I think I was probably 7 or so, 7 or 8. So my brothers would have been 9 and 10, and my cousin was 9. Well, you can imagine, after a while, things started getting boring. And we started not getting along that well. And we started arguing and fighting constantly. I know now, having been an adult and trying to drive with things going on behind me, how distracting that can be. But when you're 8 or 9 or 7 years old, you don't think about that. You don't care about that. You just want your way right then. With the other people that were sitting back there who didn't want me to have my way. So we were arguing something fierce. And it obviously was starting to fray my mother's nerves. So she pulled over and got out of the car and went back to the car behind us, which is where my uncle and my aunt were, and my grandma. And my uncle got out of his car and walked up and leaned into the car and said, I just want you boys to know that when we get to Hansel's, I'm going to tan you guys' hide like it's never been tanned before. You all need to settle down so that your mother can concentrate and drive. If there's any more fighting before we get there, there'll even be more tanned hides. My uncle was a huge man. He worked for Crane Plumbing. He worked around fittings and pipes all day. When he was in the Navy, he was a pipe fitter on the ships in the Navy. My uncle could pick up, these big valve things, that they hook huge pipes together. He could just pick one up in each hand and walk off with them. He was a big guy. He scared us that day, rightfully so. We had several other stops before we were going to get there in doing some sightseeing, I guess you could say, on the way. Those stops that we made, I'll be honest with you, I don't remember them all. I don't think I enjoyed the rest of the trip until we got there. Because hanging over my head was the fact that I knew that once we got there, it didn't make any difference how good we were from that point until we got there. We knew when we got there, we were going to get it. And it hung over me so much that I know I didn't enjoy any of the places that we stopped until we got there and we got our punishment, and then we could move on, or at least I could. Now please understand that I'm aware that my experience, or whatever you may have experienced when I brought this up to begin with, hardly compares to what Jesus was experiencing. But maybe it gives you a sense of what I'm trying to get at here. Because I think 10,000 times worse than our experience is the challenge that Jesus faced during the final week of his life. As he came into Jerusalem, hearing the praises of people, receiving the welcome of a king, he knew that in just a few days he would be stripped and beaten and tortured and ridiculed and mocked and humiliated and ultimately put to death in the most painful way possible. And yet he chose to put all of that aside and live fully in the moment of triumph that was going on. When the Pharisees told him to tell his disciples to stop, he said, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. He knew that this event had to take place regardless of what lay ahead. For one, It was the fulfillment of prophecy. Zechariah said, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Zechariah prophesied about what was going to happen when Jesus came into Jerusalem. The triumphal entry had to take place, not only to fulfill that prophecy, but because for years to come, thousands and thousands of people who had been in Jerusalem would remember the significance of that event. Jesus knew everything that would happen by the time the week would come to an end, but he refused to let that moment in the future to diminish the importance of what was happening right then. There's always trouble around the bend. And it'll be that way until we get to heaven. There will always be sadness in our future. It's inevitable and it's unavoidable. Don't let the certainty of future sadness prevent you from experiencing the joy of this moment in all of its fullness. That's what it means to live life in the now. A second observation that I want to make about this story is Jesus knew that many in the crowd would turn against him, and yet he received their praise. I think one of the saddest things about the entire Passion narrative is how, in the end, the mob turned against him. The very people who he had championed during the course of his ministry, the people that he had treated with compassion and dignity, would soon call for his death, while at the same time calling for the release of a murderer, Barabbas. If nothing else, this action proves to us that the hive mind is not just some kind of an internet phenomenon. I think maybe the internet makes it worse at times, but there have always been those who can only think what the group tells them to think. And when the tide of public opinion sways in a new direction, they sway right along with it. You just have to watch the news for a few minutes to see that this happens every single day. Jesus understood this tendency in people. He knew that there were some in the crowd who were just going along for the show, just there for the entertainment and nothing more. He knew that their convictions could change in a flash as soon as some new idea became fashionable. And Jesus knew that on the day of the triumphal entry, and on the day that he fed 5,000 people, and he knew when he healed the sick, and yet he continued to do good for people, knowing that some of those that he was serving would turn on him. Crowds are fickle. Those who are booing you today might be cheering you tomorrow, and vice versa, because crowds are fickle. But of course, not all the people in the crowd are fickle. Some remain faithful. And so Jesus received the praise of the crowd in the moment, knowing that some of them might turn away, and knowing that perhaps some of them would ultimately find their way back to him. What I'm saying is that rather than dismissing the praise of the crowd, Jesus received it. Imperfect and as temporary as it was. Have you ever been on the receiving end of a kindness, but you couldn't really appreciate it because you had doubts about the person's motives? Have you ever received an apology, but you weren't able to really accept it because you questioned their sincerity? This kind of thing happens all the time. Happens in families, between spouses, and between parents and children. One person says, "I'm sorry," and the other one thinks, "Yeah, you don't mean that." One person says, "I want to do better," and the other person thinks, "Yeah, I've heard that before." Imagine that when Jesus had come into Jerusalem and the multitudes were shouting, "Hosanna!" He had cut them off and said, "You don't really mean that. You're not sincere. Most of you will be gone in a few days. Your words mean nothing to me." Now, you can't really imagine Jesus doing that, can you? Instead, when the crowd began to praise him, he let them. Because in this moment, they were doing right. Yeah, some of them were soon going to turn away. But in this moment, right then, it was as it should have been. When a person comes to you with an apology and expresses a desire to make things better, that's not the time to shoot them down and make them feel worse. Instead, you have the opportunity to make that moment exactly as it should be, a moment of grace and a moment of growth. Don't let the fact that the people in your life aren't perfect prevent you from living fully in each moment of the relationship. Perhaps there have been failures in the past. Perhaps there will be disappointments in the days to come. But when another person, whether your spouse, your child, your friend, your coworker, I don't care who it is, but when they make a move in the right direction, make the most of that moment. Make it a moment of grace and a moment of growth. And then here's the third observation about the triumphal entry that I want to bring to your attention. Jesus knew that his followers wouldn't fully understand the events as they occurred, and yet he asked them to participate. John tells us in John 12:16, his disciples did not understand these things at first. However, when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things had been written about him and that they had done these things to him. Most of the meaning of this significant event in history was completely lost on his disciples while it was taking place. They knew that it was an exciting moment, but they didn't understand all the implications that were coming. I'd venture to say that most of us don't fully understand the significance of life's most meaningful moments as they occur. It's usually weeks or months or even years later before we realize what that moment really meant. We may not fully understand the significance of everything that happens in our lives, but we can learn to be observant. We can learn to practice awareness. We can learn to pay attention to each and every moment, each and every day of our lives. I'm talking about making it a habit to live in the now, to fully acknowledge the significance of every moment of your life. Because who knows what this moment might be trying to teach me. The same is true for our children. Many of the lessons that we want to teach them, they're not going to get, at least not now, anyway. It might be years before the meaning of the moment is made clear to them. But we need to give them those moments nonetheless. We need to teach them those lessons even if they don't fully appreciate their value at the time. There were things that my mother tried to teach me, to get across to me when I was younger. And I know that in those moments, I would roll my eyes at her, at least on the inside. But then when I started working, and when I was in college, and then beyond that, those lessons started coming back to me. And I finally understood what it was that my mother was trying to teach me. Jesus knew that the significance of the triumphal entry would be lost on many of those present in Jerusalem that day. And yet he entered triumphantly anyway. He recognized the value of each moment, and he lived fully in the present, in the now. And he challenges us to do the same. There will be victories and defeats in life. Whichever you're experiencing today, just realize that the other one is no doubt just around the bend. Each event has its meaning. Even when you don't fully understand all that's going on around you, you can still practice awareness. You can still live each moment with your eyes wide open and your heart receptive to what God is doing. When you experience a victory, experience it fully. Savor it. Don't let the uncertainty of what's coming tomorrow get in the way of today's joy. When you experience a setback, experience it like a student learning from a master, because each moment of your life is packed with meaning. I'm talking about living your life in the now. Making a choice to, as Proverbs 3:5-6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Last week I talked about the importance of tagging along, going, seeing where God was working, and join him there, tagging along with Jesus. And one of the ways we do this is by acknowledging him in every moment of every day. Bill Gaither wrote a song several years ago about living in the now. It's called We Have This Moment Today. I want to read one of the verses and the chorus. Hold tight to the sound of the music of living, happy songs from the laughter of children at play. Hold my hand as we run through the sweet, fragrant meadows, making memories of what was today. We have this moment to hold in our hands and to touch as it slips through our fingers like sand. Yesterday's gone and tomorrow may never come, but we have this moment today. We have these moments in our lives, and they may be fleeting, and we may not always understand the fullness of their significance, but we have these moments. We have this moment to hold in our hands, to experience in its fullness, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. It's a defining moment that occurs in your life again and again and again, because this defining moment recognizes the value of each and every moment. That defining moment empowers us to say, I live my life in the now. I live my life always in the presence of my Lord. Take out your prayer request or sheets, if you would.